One Piece has had the return of the legendary Scopper Gaban, as well as the appearance of two new god knights. But one of them has a power that refers to yet another creature from Japanese mythology that you likely aren't familiar with unless you're deeply knowledgeable about Japanese folklore. So as usual, let's break down all the details in these chapters of One Piece as we dive into the history of races, Scopper, and the god knights. On the cover, Who's Who has captured two rebels, being two shadows collapsing to the ground. While it may be hard to make out at first, these are pretty clearly the silhouettes of Ulti and Page 1, and the fact they have been labeled as rebels seems to indicate that they may have tried fighting back against Who's Who for control of what remains of the Beast's pirates, but were defeated by him, putting them in a rough situation now that their adoptive father, Kaido, is gone. Could this point towards them helping to agree to work with Yamato, or will Ulti simply be unwilling to get over her grudge? Back at Aura's castle, the group continues searching for the key, but ultimately comes across the castle's throne room, what in Japanese is usually called the Onoma, or King's Chamber. It's as we saw it before, but we get a better look at it, showing how it's very much in ruins. An interesting detail is the fact that on the wall, there's a cut in the shape of three lines that seems like an attack caused by the claws of a large monster. Could this be hinting at Loki's true powers, being some sort of clawed creature, or is this something else like Loki unleashing some of the underworld beasts in this room? A skeleton is also still found on the ground if you look closely. Furthermore, part of the roof has collapsed, as we are told, either from the old battle or from the arrival of Shamrock and Gunko, but either way, it seems they used that to sneak in. Road spots said magic circle, which the Straw Hats don't see at first since they struggle to see it from ground level, so they hop on his hand. Nami claims that she has read in a book before about these magic circles, claiming that in some far-off country they do rituals to try and summon devils. It's worth noting that the Japanese word for magic used here, mahojin as in magic circle, uses the kanji for devil, because magic was associated with a devilish witchcraft, so in a sense this magic circle also literally refers to being a devil-invoking circle. Nami's claim about some country that uses these circles is likely referring to Harhetania, the country on Namakura Island where Brook was taken during the time skip. There we saw how the people used magic circles to invoke the devil, who in reality likely is the myth that remained of Imu's existence in the distant past, but they ended up summoning Brook instead, who they mistook as the devil. In that case, said circle was fairly similar, also featuring writing that differs from the standardized Kyogo language. Luffy also recalls having seen this circle somewhere, as he clearly saw it during the Egghead incident when the Gorosei spawned in, but can't quite recall as usual. The group, however, suddenly hears a voice, and Road grows scared and starts chanting the expression Shizumari Tamae, which is essentially a ritual chant to ask spirits to be gone, fundamentally meaning go back to resting. As they are stopped by a giant axe, however, Road drops Luffy, Nami, and Zoro, but Luffy grabs her with his arm to help Nami out and drops her onto Zoro. The mysterious man goes by the name of Yaa-san, finally solving the mystery of Colin's father that has been set up for several episodes and finally freeing us of the Shiki theories. This is clearly the man from the cover of chapter 631, the man who told the Straw Hats to come to Elbaf, and the one who has been set up ever since. Most One Piece fans will surely recognize who he is, but let's play along with the chapter for now, as he's called by the people of Elbaf as Yaa-san. San in this case is obviously the honorific of Mr. in Japanese, so he's basically called Ya with an elongated A sound. Road instead calls him Ya-shi, using the honorific shi, which is incredibly formal and considered a bit outdated, likely due to Road essentially speaking like a weeb. Yaa-san claims to have come to the castle due to having felt a strong haki, but it now seems to be gone, showing that his observation haki likely picked up on Shamrock and Gunko. As we imagine, he is Colin's father, and as we also imagine, Colin is 20 years old, while Ripley is 80, making her older than her husband. And though he laments that, Yaa-san also firmly believes that love is freedom, establishing one of the most fundamental themes of One Piece, that love and friendship are things that transcend race, gender, or any belief. He even calls himself an Aino Dendoshi, or a missionary of love, an evangelist of love, striking a pose that is incredibly similar to that of Odin, for reasons that should become pretty apparent where he got it from. He begins talking about mixed races in the world of One Piece, mentioning the Buccaneers, the Dosundada, the Longarm Lagneck, necks, the wotans, and so on. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to go over all the races and hybrid races in the world of One Piece. These races are often translated by some fans as tribes, but the word zoku in this context is more correctly translated as race. In terms of pure-blood races, we have of course the most numerous of them all, ningen or humans. After that we have the sea dwellers, the fishmen, or in Japanese gyojin, and their female counterparts, fishwoman. In Japanese we don't really distinguish in gender in a word like gyojin, so fishman, fishwoman is just more of an English thing. Similarly we have the mermen or ningyo, or in English their female counterparts, merwoman, what we more commonly translate as mermaids. Then we have the sky people or angels, tenshi, as they are also called by others, which are divided into three sub-races. Skypians, though they locally call themselves skyfolk or sora no mono, Shandians, and Burkans. Furthermore, there are the Lunaria, who are angels that have seemingly evolved in the past, implicitly through the use of the bloodline elements to become more powerful and advanced. Then we have the animal-like minks, of course, as well as what are called little people or kobito, which we usually localize as dwarves, known more properly as the Tontata race. Then there are also the giants or kyojin, like as in Shingeki no Kyojin, but there's a different unique race which we call the ancient giants or Kodai Kyojin, who are far larger with colored skins and large horns. Furthermore, there are the mystery giants or Nazo no Kyojin, the race that the Yeti Cool brothers pertain to, though we don't know if that's a hybrid or another unique race. Closer to humans are the races of long limbs, what are known to be the long arm race or Tenaga, the long leg race or Ashinaga, and the snake neck race or Jakubi, not to be erroneously called long necks. And on top of it, of course, there's also the three-eyed race or Mitsume, who seem to have some affinity with the voice of all things. Finally, there's the unique case of the Kuja, because they are technically a hybrid race despite also being unique. And this is because all Kuja are fundamentally humans but can only give birth to females, meaning that they must reproduce with a man to have a child. We were told that Kuja leave Amazon Lily when they grow up to find a suitor and return to their homeland to give birth to a girl, meaning they need to continue reproducing with male humans to stay alive, so they are inherently hybrid in some regard, always needing a male non-Kuja parent. With that said, we move on to hybrid races, mixes of other races. For starters, it's worth noting that fishmen and mermen can procreate together without really creating hybrids, as their kids come out as either fishmen or mermen. But with other races, we have the boringly named half-fishmen or Han-gyojin. In this case, it's a hybrid between a human and a fishman, and an example would be Dellinger of the Don Quixote pirates, who is half-fighting fish, hence the horns and spiked teeth. Other hybrids include Sapi, who you likely don't remember but was a fishmonger at Lockdown, then interacted with Sanji, as well as Charlotte Deschamps, 44th son of Big Mom. In Deschamps' case, he looked a lot more like a fishman, while Dellinger and Sapi looked closer to humans, so I guess it's more of a matter of dominant or recessive genes. We also similarly have half merman or half ningyo. Kokoro from Water 7 had a kid with a local human, and since she was a mermaid, the kid was a half merman, who then had a kid with another human that then became Chimney, who is 1/4 mermaid. Chimney doesn't keep any mermaid traits anymore, but is incredibly proficient at swimming, which is how she was able to save Luffy in the powerful whirlpools of Enies Lobby, according to Oda. At the same time, Big Mom's daughter Charlotte Prim and Charlotte Praline are also both half mermaids as well. They look pretty much the same as normal mermaids. We haven't seen natural angel hybrids yet, but the Seraphim are special cases as they are all artificial hybrids. As Hawk is a human Lunaria hybrid, as Snake is a Kuja Lunaria hybrid, as Shark is a Fishman Lunaria hybrid, and as Bear is a Buccaneer Lunaria hybrid, which the Viver cards recalled is why he had extra endurance as well when Luffy was punching him. In terms of long-limbed people, this is where it gets confusing because as we mentioned, we have long arms, long legs, and snake necks. But in Whole Cake Island, Big Mom mentioned having a long arm leg, a special hybrid of long arms and long legs. This is incorrectly translated sometimes as long-limbed, but the correct term in Japanese is te ashinaga or long arm leg. However, in this chapter, Yaa-san mentions the te ashikubi naga, the long arm leg-neck race, implying a triple hybrid between all three races. As such, it's likely that long arm necks and long leg necks exist too. What a headache. Though beyond that, there's also Big Mom's children who either were half long arms, long legs, or snake necks, as well as Pudding being a half three eyes. Other bizarre-looking Charlotte members existed, such as the pumpkin-looking Charlotte Cateau or the devilish-looking Charlotte Dacroix, but we have no info on their races. Big Mom also had a unique race called a Mushroom Man or Kinokobito with 4 legs trapped in her library. We haven't really seen mink hybrids yet, but in this chapter we are told of the Dosundada, who we don't know who they are, but by the name we can assume that they are likely half human, half Tontata hybrids, or a hybrid with some other race like fishmen or something like that. We already have seen a half human, half Tontata in the form of Charlotte Normand, one of Big Mom's final children, the result of what must have been a very brave father. And finally we have the giants. On one hand, we already know of the giant fishman hybrids, as they are known by the name of Watans. Often mistranslated with an O, their phonetic name likely stands for water titans, Watans, and are written with the kanji Gyokyojin, or fish giants. The only example we have in canon is Big Pan, the member of the Foxy Pirates who was half mudfish, but due to being a hybrid also appeared far smaller than normal giants, being closer to around 10 meters than 20. Furthermore, we were told just recently how ancient giants mixed with the giants resulted in people like Harald, who retained horns and were taller than normal giants due to their heritage. Similarly, we speculated that people like Kaido or Yamato likely are half human, half ancient giant, what Kaido described as being Oni, which at this point are likely an actual race. But the question stands between half humans and half giants because of course we see the case here with Cullen, but Yaa-san also tells us that buccaneers are a hybrid race, as after all Ivankov did mention during God Valley in 1095 that buccaneers have the blood of giants. But then, what hybrid race do they pertain to? Are they half human, half giant? But if so, does Cullen qualify as a buccaneer, and why isn't he as bulky as Kuma? I think the likelier explanation is that it's a similar case as half fish men, who in some cases their dominant genes make them look more like fish men, while other times as humans. So in this case, Cullen may be more giant-like, while someone like Kuma or his father Clap were more human-like. We also saw that Clap reproduced with a human, and yet Kuma was still a full buccaneer, so maybe it's more like a half human, half giant, whose blood has diluted a bit over the years. I hope at least get a slightly clearer explanation. Either way, let's move on from this biology lesson as the group reaches the treasure room under the throne, mostly abandoned but where the key rests. However, the man claims that if Luffy wants to get the key, then he'll have to fight him, as he reveals himself to be, surprise surprise to no one's shock, Scopper Gaban, the left arm of the Pirate King. For starters, Scopper Gaban's name has been in contention because while fans and Viz have written it as Gaban, in Japanese it's actually Gyaban with a Y. This Gya is likely where the Ya in Yaa-san comes from, which kinda gets lost if you translate it as just Gaban. However, it's also arguable that Gaban has a soft sound to it, that writing it with a G could also be a valid romanization, as it's written Gaban but you pronounce it as Gaban, you know, like that very subtle Y, so it's hard to say. It's sort of similar to how a character like Kyros is actually pronounced as Kyros, but is romanized as Kyros, while still pronounced that way, Kyros. Either way, his family name, Scopper, as keep in mind his actual name is Gaban, creates an obvious pattern in the names of the Pirate King's crew, as Goldie Roger obviously stands for gold, Silver's Rayleigh stands for silver, and Scopper Gaban starts for copper, the 3 podium medals in order. Either way, Gaban really needs no introductions, as he was the 3rd most important man on the Pirate King's crew. He first appeared in chapter 19 during Buggy's flashback, already seen wielding his iconic axes, though one of them was obscured, making fan wonders for years what kind of weapon it actually was, only to turn out to be another 2nd axe. Then he reappeared in chapter 0 and then finally Odin's flashback. He was actually only originally named in a data book, but was eventually named by Roger in chapter 966 many years later. He fights with 2 axes, and as the myth of how he came to be, known as the Mountain Eater within this chapter, is detailed, and he also was seen charting out a map during Odin's flashback, suggesting he may have been the navigator of the Roger Pirate pirates. If really was like Roger's Zoro, Gaban was likely Roger's Nami, though in strength I'm sure you could compare him to one of the others as well, particularly with Luffy comparing him to Sanji. Now Gaban has been living for over 2 decades on Elbaf, having married Ripley in the same way Roger settled with Rouge and Rayleigh with Shakuyaku. He appears to have a much more laid-back attitude but still carries his iconic glasses. His beard is now longer and his hair a lighter color, though I wondered if he did change his hair to be blonde or if the colored manga simply made a coloring mistake in that cover. Though speaking of which, it's pretty impressive he went all the way back to Reverse Mountain in the span of just 2 in-world months, but I wonder if he went back through the normal route or if he instead traveled to the end of the New World and just climbed up Reverse Mountain. Most interesting though is the scar on his face, making one wonder just who exactly caused such a wound on his face, particularly as he didn't have it by the time the Roger Pirates disbanded. I also have to wonder if he has lived in Elbaf all this time, then surely he must have tried to stop Loki. Could even someone like Gaban have failed, with only Shanks having been able to later stop him, or did something get in the way? Either way, now Gaban stands in Luffy's way as he wants to test him if he would be capable of stopping Loki, perhaps because he back then may not have been able to. As the duel begins, Gaban coats the key in Haki and strikes Luffy with it. Luffy notices as we see the key turn black from the Armin Haki as he gets ready to strike him. Black lightning sparks come out of the key strike, but it's not clear if this is just from Armament Haki or if this is due to Conqueror's Haki, particularly with how confusing it's been so far. Gaban similarly keeps dodging attacks in a similar way Luffy does, particularly when using advanced observation, but again it's hard to say for sure to which degree it's honed. As Luffy complains that Gaban knows nothing about Shanks though, Gaban uses the expression "Kuchi no hera ne ga kida," which literally means "you're a kid who can't shut his mouth," which refers to a child who doesn't stop talking and complaining. So in this case he quite literally shuts Luffy's mouth by shoving the key inside of it. Gaban then unleashes a serious attack, which he calls Yaso Takeru, which translates to 80 commanders or 80 warriors, 80 generals. This name has historical value as it's likely a reference to the same name used in the Nihon Shoki, one of the oldest historical texts to have survived in Japan. This text allegedly describes the Yaso Takeru as a force of 80 mighty commanders who stood against Jimmu, the first emperor of Japan. And yet even in spite of such an overwhelming force, we're still crushed and defeated by him. The attack is so powerful that it completely blows away one of the towers of Orist Castle, sending it plummeting to the underworld below. Now, this also gives us a good frame of reference for where in the castle the throne room is located, adjacent to this tower. Luffy, joined by Zoro, strikes back transforming Gear 5th, with his helmet horns having fused with his head just as we saw in the Block Country, and grabbing the axe he was carrying on his back. Here we also get a better look at Gaban's actual eyes. But in the end, Gaban forfeits as Luffy has already gotten the key, but despite what he says, seemingly sensing that something might go wrong with Elbaf, he likely will join in the fight, particularly if his son Colin gets kidnapped. At the Walrus School, the kids seem to spot Gunko's bird telling their teachers, which includes Ange as well as another bearded teacher. Gunko however heads to a secluded branch and prepares to summon another God Knight as mentioned. Just like Saturn did on Egghead, it seems that these summoning circles can be created by those who are conferred Imu's powers, but this requires at least one person who has these powers, which is why Saturn had to head to Egghead on his own. Later in the chapter, this is mentioned as those who have the mark, literally just maku in Japanese, and those who don't have it can't travel through this summoning circle, likely as only Imu can confer the mark. This however means that the summoning circle in the throne room must have been placed there by someone with powers conferred by Imu, but then who in Elbaf could have placed that summoning circle there? It's possible that perhaps these circles could last a long time, so maybe that original circle was placed a while ago, though surely not too far back that the other giants wouldn't have noticed it. So who was it? Was it the God Knights during a previous visit, or do we perhaps have another traitor among us? We do get however an actual name for these summoning circles, as they are called Abyss. The phonetic reading is Abisu, which stands for abyss, but the kanji reading is that of Gobosei. Now obviously, even if you don't speak Japanese, the word should sound very familiar, because it's almost identical to that of Gorosei. As I've previously explained, the Gorosei means the 5 elder planets. In the past, other translations localized it as the 5 elder stars, because the word hoshi or sei in Japanese can mean star, but it generally means more widely celestial body. This is because in ancient times, when these words were made, the lights in the night sky were simply known as sei, or stars, and the distinction between planets and stars only came with the development of science and the understanding of these bodies. English did eventually distinguish both with the words planet and star, but Japanese still generally doesn't, which is where that confusion came from, as Gorosei in this case means planets, but can technically also mean stars. This however all ties in with this current pun, because while the sei in Gorosei refers to planets, particularly of course the 5 elder planets referring to the 5 closest planets that were visible in ancient times, and that the Gorosei are named after, Gobosei here refers to star. Particularly, Gobosei translates to 5-pointed star, what would be called a pentagram in English. And as we see, this pentagram is indeed a star with 5 spikes to it. The connection between the Gorosei and the Gobosei is pretty evident, particularly as the elders also used the same summoning circles, but the nuance gets slightly lost in English due to the difference between planet and star. Regardless, the actual phonetic name used here is abyss, which is fitting as it invokes the idea of an abyss that takes you straight to hell. Interestingly, as Nami mentioned last chapter, the people of Harahetania tried using these circles to summon the devil through them, as this might be a practice that they may have picked up after witnessing a real abyss being used sometime in the past. From the abyss, we see in several panels the sound effects bari bari, which represent the cracking of thunder and often been used when Conqueror's Haki has been used, though also in other contexts to be fair, perhaps associating the black lightning with the same we see when Haki is used. However, from the abyss, not 1, but 2 god knights are summoned. The first is Saint Shepherd Sommers. His family name is Shepherd, which as you may realize is the same as that of Saint Shepherd Jupiter, one of the Gorosei, showing that they are part of the same family, and you can indeed see some resemblance between both of their appearances. This brings into question, however, what the relation is, particularly the question on if the Gorosei have children or not. Particularly being perennially youthful, do they have children that end up dying but then have children of their own, or could they simply be distant relatives, with different shepherd children having been born from the original founder 800 years ago, and one of them that was born eventually became Jupiter, who was promoted to Gorosei and granted special powers by Imu. Either way, his first name instead is written in Japanese as Sommers, which would translate as something like Sommers, a name that etymologically traces to the word for summer if that's the intended romanization. Interestingly, without the first kana of So, the remainder of his name, Maz, is written just like Mars, the name of one of the other Gorosei and one of the planets of course. So his name could be Sommers, but I find it weird given how he's related to Jupiter rather than Mars. Interestingly, in this case, both of these god knights do have the title of Sei or Saint next to them, unlike Shamrock and Gunko, so I wonder if that was just a weird formatting choice by Oda rather than having much of a meaning to it. Sommers, however, has been summoned pretty suddenly, to the point he was still talking on his Dendenmushi about having received orders to go to Elbaf, as evidenced by the baby Dendenmushi he's carrying now not working anymore due to being out of Marijoa range. Perhaps more evident is the fact he is comfortably sitting on his opulent couch in his heart-patterned underwear, only carrying a tank top but a cape on top of it just to feel more majestic. Gunko gets pretty embarrassed by him being in his underwear that she blushes and turns away, and he still thinks that he's in his home until he realizes that he's in Elbaf. Alongside him also spawned in a chest, which happens to have clothing he suits himself up with after and his sword. With his clothes, he looks a lot more like a proper military general, and we get a better look at his sword, which appears to have a shape similar to Shank's or Shamrock's sabers, but with a handle in the shape of a rose's thorns. This is fitting as on his chest, aside from all the medals, which includes one on his boot as well, well, he also has a rose, which could hint to some form of rose theming or even powers. On his belt, he carries a symbol which features the hoof of the soaring dragon, the symbol of the celestial dragons, representing the claw of a dragon, but in this case combined with 2 wings. This could perhaps be the symbol of the God Knights, but on his sleeve, better seen in the panel of the other fellow God Knight, is another mark, which looks like a cross similar to that seen in graves across the series, being a cross with a circle on top of it, but in this case having 2 horns popping out of it, like some demonic type of imagery. So maybe this could be the actual symbol for the God Knights, so who knows. He also appears to have a tattoo on his left arm, but it's hard to see if it shows anything specific or just to look cool. Could this perhaps be the mark they speak of to be granted powers, or is it just a tattoo? And speaking of symbols, his beard is in the shape of a cross. This could totally just be a coincidence and I'm looking too much into it, but Jupiter's name is written with a kanji for 10, Ju making his name literally just 10 Peter. This kanji is depicted in Japanese as a cross, just like the shape of his beard, so wonder if that was intentional or just a coincidence. We don't know what demonic power he has for now, but he's likely to have one just like all the others. The other God Knight is Saint Rimoshifu Kiringham. His family name, Rimoshifu, is actually a new name we haven't gotten before, being a newly revealed name for one of the celestial dragon families. We previously had half of them, being Nerona, Nefertari, Don Quixote, Figarland, Manmayer, J. Garcia, Marcus, Topman, Ethan Barron, and Shepard. But with this one, we now know 11 out of 20, and I'm sure before the end of the series, we'll find out the remaining 9. Since it's new though, it's hard to say for sure how we should romanize this name, as in Japanese, it's written as the quite peculiar Rimoshifu, which could be anything from Rimoshifu to Limoshifu, Limoshiv, or anything in between. Given how he seems to be based on a creature from Chinese mythology, I thus wonder if it could be Limshifu, which is an actual Chinese name, but for the moment I'll keep it as it is in Japanese just to play it safe. His first name instead is Kiringamu, which would be romanized as something like Kiringham. Names that bear gam at the end of it, like Birmingham, are derived from the etymology of home, thus referring to an old settlement and often associated with medieval towns and nobility. In this case though, the word Kirin refers to a creature from Japanese mythology, and it becomes very evident if you know anything about Japanese culture once you look at Kiringham's design, because the power he has is very clearly that of a Kirin. But if you aren't, this gets a bit lost in translation, so let me explain. The Kirin is a creature from Chinese mythology, which is there spelled as the Chirin, which is then imported to Japanese folklore as the demonic yokai beast, the Kirin. It is depicted as being similar to a giraffe, as even in ancient China, sometimes giraffes from far-off lands were mistaken as Qilin, but with a far more ornate mane and horns on its head, usually 1, but also depicted with 2 in later depictions, though in this case, Kiringham seems to be depicted with the canonically accurate single horn. Fundamentally, think of it like an Eastern unicorn, but resembling more a giraffe than a horse. As a result, the modern Japanese word for giraffe is also Kirin, though not to be mistaken with the beast depending on the context. Though classified in Japan as a demonic yokai, it is one considered in this case instead to be holy and revered, said to only appear during times of peace in peaceful lands. Their arrival is said to herald either the birth or the death of a great leader or wise man. They generally do not pursue and attack others, but will fight back if attacked, said to be able to generate some form of holy fire, being one of the most powerful sacred beasts in all of Eastern mythology, so perhaps that will tie with Kiringham's powers here. You may perhaps be familiar as well with the world-famous Kirin beer, which depicts an actual Kirin on its logo as well. In this case, Kiringham does very much look like an actual Kirin transformed in his hybrid form, from the long neck, the ornate mane, and the single horn and long whiskers, though he is covering his head with a bubble and a gas mask, much like the celestial dragons do when they do not wish to breathe the air of other places, perhaps readying up to be deployed. He also has a Hagoromo cloud scarf, though light-colored in this case, fitting the majestic appearance of the Kirin compared to some of the other creatures, showing that he is awakened like all the other demonic creatures of the Gorosei, which he almost certainly pertains to. This likely being another devil power granted by evil, given how the Kirin is still technically a yokai. The only exception so far has been Gunko, because she has what seems like Paramisha powers, but given how her powers are quite seemingly trying to evoke the image of an Itan Momen, the yokai that turns into bandages, I'd say she still fits the pattern of all of them having devil-like powers, which once again brings into question what Sommers' powers are, and if Shamrock himself has one too, aside from the sword, as they might all be tied with receiving the mark, and maybe even obligatory in that sense. It's also worth noting that some believe that the God Knights may be themed after the zodiacs, particularly with the celestial theming of the celestial dragons. Some associated that Shamrock could be Gemini due to being twins, Gunko could be Sagittarius as it represents the arrow, and the bull-like God Knight we saw in God Valley could be Taurus. However, it's hard to really find a pattern for either Sommers or Kiringham, though granted we don't know much about them either, so who knows if this pattern will hold true or not. Kiringham has a very peculiar weapon, as he has a long spear almost shaped like a trident, except one of the blades comes out lower. When transformed in his hybrid form, Kiringham appears to be considerably taller than even Shamrock, though Sommers appears to be pretty tall as well. Kiringham was similarly taken by surprise as he was trying to rush to some place he was expected to be summoned from since he had overslept. For being so high and mighty though, both Sommers and Kiringham speak quite informally, with Kiringham referring to his Dancho commander Shamrock with the quite informal pronoun of Anta, to the point he seems to even be bothering Gunko a bit slightly with how goofily and informally he speaks. And obviously they don't refer to each other with the same titles but just by their names. However, it's peculiar that two God Knights came instead of one, peculiarly as even Shamrock didn't seem aware of this, so I wonder if it was Gunko who opened up the abyss but then it was Imo himself who handpicked who got to go instead through telepathy or something like that, as if Gunko knew she would have likely told Shamrock. This is however because, due to orders from above, Shamrock is requested to return back, with the orders likely having come from the Gorosei, particularly Garling who might still be the supreme commander of the God Knights, or maybe even Imu directly. This seems to do with the precarious situation the Holy Land is in after the Levely, though I wonder if something more is happening with either the revolutionaries or particularly Blackbeard that is making them worried enough to have Shamrock back. This is fitting as having the power of the Kerberus on his sword, Shamrock essentially acts as the gatekeeper of hell of Marie-Joie. On the other hand though, I wonder if he really will disappear from this arc or if something will hold him up to get involved. Sommers makes an odd comment when asking why they are at Elbaf, asking Shamrock if he is visiting Harold's grave, suggesting some connection between the two. This deepens the conspiracy theory that has been brewing for a while that Harold may have been in cahoots with the government and Loki was just trying to stop him. Misunderstood by all. After being told the mission though, Sommers replies with "Okay, okay," said in English even in the Japanese release. They want to bring them hostage in Marie-Joie to force Elbaf into submission, but will have to do so by boat since they don't have the mark. Shamrock however suggests that given their powers, they should try turning this into a game. In this case, the pronoun used here is omaitachi, which is a gender-neutral second-person plural pronoun, thus referring to the power of more than one person. Seemingly, Shamrock believes that by using their powers, they can make this a twisted and sadistic game, which is particularly cruel considering these are just children. He may not be taking this very seriously now, but this incident might serve as the spark of a much larger conflict to come.